Who kidnapped Nancy Guthrie reveal a sick plot to continue to torment the missing grandmother's devastated family for a quick profit, according to a former FBI agent. The notes, which also claimed to know where her body could be found, were notably sent just as Guthrie's daughter, Savannah Guthrie, made her emotional return to NBC's Today Show for the first time since her mom vanished more than 2 months ago.
Pretty shot of the sun coming up. Good morning. Welcome to Today on this Monday morning. We are so glad you started your week with us, and it is good to be home.
Yes, it is good to have you back at home.
Well, here we go. Ready or not, let's do the news.
Yes, so good to have you back. All right.
The 2 new ransom notes were sent to coincide with when Savannah went back to work. That was by no mistake. That was absolutely meant to further torment her and her family, retired FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer told Newsweek. Coffindaffer says it reveals that there's still at least one person out there who wants to continue torturing the Guthrie family and is doing so by sending continued messages with zero proof of life. The 84-year-old's been missing since February 1st after authorities believe she was kidnapped from her home in Tucson, Arizona. Since her disappearance, multiple purported ransom notes have been reported, including several sent to TMZ. The 2 notes sent to TMZ on Monday were sent from the same anonymous person who just 2 months ago demanded 1 Bitcoin from the Guthries in exchange for information. The first note claimed that Guthrie was dead, but the sender said that their offer to deliver the kidnappers on a silver platter for the cryptocurrency still stands. In the second note, they claimed to have seen Guthrie alive with her captors in Sonora, Mexico, right across the Arizona border. They said they'd surrender the information for half a Bitcoin, with the other half transferred to their wallet when there's a public arrest. Coffinder thinks they're lying about a lead to any real information, given that they're only asking for a Bitcoin worth $71,000 instead of the massive reward that's been offered by the Guthrie family and law enforcement time and time again.
Before we begin, if you follow cases like this, where every update matters, stay with us and let us know where you're watching from. We keep covering this case because we understand how difficult it is when answers are not clear, and we want to keep people informed as things develop. A new development has entered the Nancy Guthrie case, and it changes the direction of the conversation in a very specific way. Someone has asked for Bitcoin. Not a rumor, not speculation, a direct request tied to messages sent to media outlets. The same messages that claim to have information about what happened. And now the question is not just what they are saying, it is why they are asking for money. The message is simple on the surface. The sender claims to have knowledge about Nancy. They suggest they know something important. And then they introduce a condition, payment in Bitcoin. That changes everything. Because when money enters a situation like this, the meaning of the message becomes more complicated. It is no longer just about information. It becomes a transaction. A request in exchange for something that may or may not be real. And that is where investigators begin to slow things down. They do not react to the request itself. They react to what it represents. Because in cases like this, real information is not usually presented this way. When someone truly knows something important, and especially something that could help solve a case, there are other ways to come forward. Direct contact with law enforcement. Anonymous tips. Verified communication channels. But this is different. This message was sent to media outlets. That matters. Because it suggests the sender wanted attention. Public attention. And when attention and money appear together, investigators begin to ask a different kind of question. Is this about helping or something else? Now look closer at the request itself. Bitcoin, a form of payment that is harder to trace than traditional methods. A form of payment often used when someone does not want to be identified easily. That detail is not ignored, because it tells investigators something about intent. It suggests the sender is thinking about anonymity, about distance, about not being found. And that adds another layer to the situation. Now connect this to what we already know about the notes. The same source, or at least the same pattern of communication, has made other claims. One of those claims says, "I know who the kidnappers are." And another says Nancy was seen alive in Sonora, Mexico. And now there is a request for Bitcoin. So the situation is no longer just about conflicting information. It is about conflicting information combined with a financial demand. And that combination raises concern because it changes how every message is viewed. Investigators do not just ask whether the information is true. They ask whether the motive behind the message affects its credibility. And when money is involved, credibility becomes harder to establish. Now think about how this would be evaluated step by step. The first question is simple. Does the sender provide anything that can be verified? Details that are not public? Information that aligns with known evidence? Anything that shows they actually know something? Because without that, the request for money becomes the main focus. And that is not a strong position. Now consider the structure of the request. In some reports, the sender does not just ask for a single payment. They suggest a condition, part of the payment first, the rest later. That detail matters because it introduces a sequence, a plan, and investigators look at that closely because real information does not usually follow that kind of structure. It does not require stage payment. It does not depend on conditions being met in that way. So the structure of the request becomes another point of analysis. Now step back and look at the bigger picture. We have messages sent to media. We have strong claims. We have contradictions, and now we have a financial demand. All of these elements together create a pattern. And that pattern does not immediately point to credibility. It points to uncertainty. And that is why investigators are not convinced, not because they are ignoring the message, but because they are testing it carefully. Now think about the timing. Why now? Why introduce a Bitcoin request at this stage? Timing is not random. Messages like this often appear when attention is already on the case, when people are watching, when interest is high, because that is when a message is most likely to be seen. And if the goal is to be noticed, timing becomes part of the strategy. Now return to the central question. If the sender truly has information, why attach a price to it? Why not provide the information first? Why not allow investigators to verify it? Why make it conditional? These are the questions that guide the investigation. Because the answers to those questions help determine whether the message is meaningful or misleading. Now consider another angle. If you were following this case closely and you saw this message, how would you interpret it? Would you see it as a possible breakthrough? Or would you see it as something that does not add up? Because both reactions are possible. And that is exactly why investigators do not rely on initial impressions. They rely on evidence. Now think again from a personal perspective. If you were Savannah, her daughter, how would this message feel? Someone is claiming to know something, but instead of sharing it, they are asking for money. Would that create hope or doubt? Because that is the position this message creates. It offers the possibility of information, but it places a condition on that possibility. And that makes it difficult to trust. Now return again to the phrase, they asked for Bitcoin. That is the fact. But the more important part is what follows. Investigators are not convinced, and that is where the case stands. Not dismissed, not accepted, but examined. Because every message, even one that raises doubt, must be looked at carefully. And that is exactly what is happening now. The claims are being compared, the request is being analyzed, and the source is being questioned. Because until something can be verified, nothing changes. The case does not move based on claims alone. It moves based on proof. And right now, proof is what is missing. So the investigation continues, with one more element added to the story: a request for Bitcoin, a claim of knowledge, and a growing question about whether any of it can be trusted. Or if you have been following this case, share your thoughts. Do you think this message means something? Or does it raise more questions than answers? Because in a situation like this, every perspective matters. As this development settles in, the focus begins to shift away from the shock of the request and towards something more important. Credibility. Because once money is introduced into a case like this, every word in the message is examined more carefully than before. Not just what is being said, but why it is being said that way. The request for Bitcoin does not exist on its own. It is connected to the earlier notes. The same pattern, the same method. Messages sent to media, not directly to investigators. Strong claims, but no confirmed proof. And now a price attached to that information. Yes, this is where investigators begin to separate the message into parts. First, the claim. The sender says they have information, that they know something about what happened, possibly even who is responsible. Second, the condition. They are asking for payment in exchange for that information. And third, the method. They chose to send this through media outlets instead of private or official channels. Each of these parts is analyzed on its own, but also as a complete picture. Because sometimes the truth is not in one detail, but in how those details connect. Now consider how investigators typically evaluate something like this. They start by asking a simple question: what can be proven? Not what sounds convincing, not what feels important, but what can actually be verified. So they look at the message closely. Does it include specific information that is not known to the public? Does it reference something only investigators would recognize? Does it contain details that match evidence already collected? If the answer to these questions is no, then the message becomes weaker and the request for money becomes stronger. Now look at the behavior behind the message, because behavior often reveals intent. The sender did not come forward quietly. They did not reach out through official channels. They sent their message where it would be seen, where it would be talked about. That matters, because people who are trying to help usually focus on getting information to the right place, not the most visible place. And that difference is important. Now think about the structure of the payment request again. Bitcoin, a form of payment chosen for a reason. It is not easily traced in the same way as traditional methods. It allows for distance, for anonymity, and that tells investigators something about the person behind the message. It suggests they are not just thinking about the information. They are thinking about how to avoid being identified, and that becomes part of the evaluation. Now connect this to the earlier contradictions. One message suggests knowledge of the kidnappers, and another suggests Nancy may still be alive. Now there is a financial demand. These elements do not exist separately. They form a pattern, and patterns are what investigators rely on, because patterns reveal consistency, or lack of it. In this case, the pattern is not consistent. The claims do not align. The message shifts. And when that happens, confidence decreases. Now consider the possibility that all of these messages are coming from the same person. If that is true, then the contradiction becomes more significant, because it suggests the same individual is presenting different versions of reality. And that raises a question: is the information changing, or is the story being adjusted? Because those are not the same thing. Now consider the other possibility, that multiple people are sending messages, each with their own claims, each with their own version of events. If that is the case, then the situation becomes even more complex, because now investigators are not dealing with one unknown source, they are dealing with several, and each one must be evaluated separately. That increases the amount of work, and it increases the chance of false leads. Now return to the idea of motive. It's not because motive plays a role in how messages are interpreted. If someone is asking for money, investigators have to consider why. Is it because they have real information and believe it has value? Or is it because they are trying to take advantage of the situation? That question does not have an immediate answer, but it guides the process because it affects how much weight is given to the message. Now think about how this affects the direction of the case. Does this request change the investigation? Does it shift resources? Does it introduce a new focus? The answer is not simple, because while the message must be examined, it does not automatically change the core of the investigation. Verified evidence still comes first. Confirmed timelines still come first. And until something in the message can be confirmed, it remains secondary. Hold on, now bring this back to the central question. They asked for Bitcoin, but why? Because understanding that answer is key to understanding the message itself. If the request is tied to real information, then it becomes more significant. If it is not, then it becomes something else entirely, something that investigators must move past. Now think again from a personal perspective. If you were Savannah, how would you process this? Someone is claiming to know something important, but they are not sharing it. They are asking for payment. Would that create trust, or would it create doubt? Because that is the position this message creates. It places information behind a condition, and that makes it difficult to accept. Now consider the emotional impact of that, because it is not just about the investigation. It is about how these messages affect the people closest to the case. Every new claim creates a reaction. Every new message introduces a new possibility. And when those messages are tied to money, the reaction changes. It becomes more complicated. more difficult to process. Now return again to the idea of credibility, because in the end, that is what determines whether this message matters. Not the strength of the claim, not the amount of attention it receives, but whether it can be proven. And right now, that proof is not there. So investigators continue. Carefully, they do not ignore the message, but they do not rely on it either. They place it where it belongs, in the category of unverified information. And they move forward with what they can confirm. Now look at the situation as it stands. A request for Bitcoin, a series of claims, one conflicting information, and no confirmation. That is the reality. And that is why investigators are not convinced, because being convinced requires evidence, and evidence is what is still missing. So the process continues, each detail examined, each claim tested, each message placed in context, and until something changes, the position remains the same, cautious, measured, focused on what can be proven. Because in a case like this, that is the only way forward. At this point, everything comes back to one idea, not what is being claimed, but what can actually be trusted. Because the moment money entered the conversation, the entire situation changed. The message is no longer just about information, it is about intent. And intent is what investigators focus on when they decide how seriously something should be taken. The request for Bitcoin is not just a detail, it is a signal. It tells investigators that the person behind the message is not only claiming to have information, but is also placing a condition on it. That condition changes how the message is viewed from the start. Because real verifiable information in cases like this is not usually presented in exchange for payment. It is given so it can be confirmed, so it can be acted on, so it can help move the case forward. Now place that next to what we have seen. Messages sent to media outlets, claims that do not fully align, and now a financial demand. All of these together create a situation where investigators have to slow down. Not because they are unsure what to do, but because moving too quickly on something unverified can cause more harm than good. Let's now return to the question of credibility one more time. What would it take for this message to be taken seriously? It would require something solid, something that connects directly to known evidence, details that cannot be guessed, information that has not been made public. Without that, the message remains where it is, unverified, and that is the category it stays in until something changes. Now think about the structure of the request again. Payment first, information later. That order matters because it places trust in the sender before anything has been proven. And that is not how investigations work. Trust is built through evidence, not through claims. So investigators reverse that order. They look for proof first, and until that proof is there, the request does not hold weight. Now consider how this fits into everything else that has been said. The earlier notes, the conflicting claims, the statement about knowing who is responsible, the claim that she was seen alive, and now the request for Bitcoin. Each of these elements adds to the story, but they do not build a clear picture. They create uncertainty. And that is why the investigation remains where it is, focused on what can be confirmed. Now think again about the possibility that this message is real. If it is, then the person behind it holds information that could matter. But if that is the case, the path forward is clear. Provide something that can be verified, something that can be checked. Because without that, the message cannot move forward. Now consider the other possibility, that the message is not real, that it is an attempt to insert into the case, to gain attention, or to create confusion. If that is the case, then the request for Bitcoin becomes the main focus, not the information. And that is exactly why investigators remain cautious, because they have to consider both possibilities at the same time. Now bring this back to the central question. They asked for Bitcoin, but investigators are not convinced. That is not a dismissal. It is a position based on the absence of proof. And until that changes, the position remains the same. Now think about how this affects the direction of the case moving forward. Does this message change the investigation? Not yet. Does it introduce a new possibility? Yes, but possibility is not enough. Because in cases like this, possibility must become proof before it can lead anywhere. Now return again to the personal side of this. Ma, if you were Savannah, how would you see this? Someone is claiming to have information, but they are asking for money before sharing it. Would that feel real, or would it feel uncertain? Because that is the reality this message creates. It places information behind a condition, and that condition makes it harder to believe. Now consider how the public responds. Some people may see this as a breakthrough. Others may see it as something that does not add up. And both reactions exist because there is no confirmation. There is only a claim and a request. Now bring everything together. The notes, the contradictions, the Bitcoin demand, the lack of confirmation. All of these elements point to the same place, uncertainty, and that is where the case stands. Not resolved, not confirmed, but still being examined. Why? Because that is how investigations work. They move forward with what can be proven, and they set aside what cannot, at least for now. So the question remains, not just who asked for Bitcoin, but why. Because understanding that answer may reveal more than the message itself. And until that answer is clear, the situation remains the same. Unverified, unconfirmed, and still under investigation. If you have been following this case, you already understand how complex it has become. And now the question is in front of you as well. Do you think this request means something, or does it raise more questions than answers? Because in a case like this, the difference between those two possibilities is everything. And for now, that difference has not been resolved.